Welcome to the deep dive. Think about the last time you had a really tricky conversation. Maybe you said something like, "Hang on, that's not what I said," or the other person goes, "Well, that's not what I heard." It happens all the time, right? So today we're diving into this paradox. Why do we so often misunderstand people, even when they seem perfectly clear?
It really is a fundamental puzzle in communication, isn't it? We've been looking into sources that explore that precise moment when the sound leaves someone's mouth and, well, hits your brain, what happens in that gap. And the core idea we're exploring today, it's quite something. It suggests that when you mishear, you're not really hearing the other person, you're hearing the echo of self.
Wow, okay. The
Yeah.
echo of self.
Yeah.
That immediately changes how you think about listening. It frames the ear as just, well, a microphone maybe. But the mind is the mixing desk, the editor. So we're not listening neutrally. We're listening through this, like filter of our own stuff, thoughts, feelings, assumptions. The sources call it prejudice.
Prejudice, exactly, or pre-existing bias. And our internal state, our mood, has this instant effect. It acts like a immediate mood filter. The source material uses a really vivid example. Someone who's feeling sad doesn't just feel sad, they actually hear the whole world as sort of lamenting. They perceive sadness and sounds around them.
Right. And then flip that if you're feeling, say, really happy or you're in love. The same sounds get interpreted completely differently.
Mhm.
The source suggests that, a person deeply in love might even hear the wind whistling and perceive it as a song. The physical sound waves are the same, but the meaning, totally transformed by the listener's emotional state.
Which forces us to face this idea that perception isn't just reality hitting our senses. Perception is interpretation. We have to shift from thinking of mishearing as just an auditory glitch and start seeing it as potentially a psychological insight.
Okay, but that feels like putting a lot of weight on just messing up a word here or there.
Yeah.
Is it always that deep? Let's maybe unpack the mechanics a bit. Why is the brain so, I guess, determined to sometimes get it wrong or assign its own meaning?
Hmm.
You mentioned the ear just gets raw data, sound waves.
Yeah.
Then the mind has to step in.
It has to assign meaning. That's absolutely crucial. Our brains are incredible pattern matchers, but they hate ambiguity. They can't really tolerate a vacuum of meaning. So if a sound is a bit unclear, maybe muffled or just ambiguous, the mind doesn't just wait patiently. It instantly leaps in to fill that gap. And it fills it with whatever makes the most sense based on its current context, what's familiar, logical, or just emotionally resonant at that moment.
And sometimes what's familiar or resonant is, just kind of funny. I really like the examples in the source material, the person who started writing down their own mishearings. They perfectly illustrate this mental leap, don't they?
No, they're brilliant illustrations because
Yeah.
the sounds are often quite similar acoustically, but the meanings, the brain substitutes, are worlds apart.
Yeah, like hearing choir practice. That's the sound. But their mind, maybe thinking about aches and pains or appointments, spits out chiropractor.
Hmm.
Or hearing grocery bag, a totally mundane phrase, and it becomes poetry bag.
Exactly. In that split second, the listener isn't actually processing the speaker's intended words. They're hearing their own internal monologue almost. The misunderstanding usually stems from the listener's own mental landscape, not necessarily from the speaker being unclear. The brain picked an interpretation that fit its internal narrative to bridge that slight auditory gap.
Which does lead us into potentially deeper territory like unconscious influences. Why these specific substitutions? It doesn't seem totally random. The sources we looked at connect this pretty directly to psychoanalytic ideas.
Yes, they do. There's a quote they mention attributed to Freud, which puts it very starkly. Every mishearing is a manifestation of the unconscious. Hmm. So it's suggesting this isn't just about sound waves and phonetics. It could be about underlying wishes, anxieties, maybe preoccupations that are shaping what we even register consciously.
Hmm. So if I hear my boss say, the report deadline is fine, but I hear the report deadline is tight, it might not be just bad acoustics in the office, but maybe my own anxiety about that deadline bubbling up and twisting the perception.
That's precisely the idea. The brain's need to kill the ambiguity means if the external signal is even slightly fuzzy, it defaults to what has the highest probability based on your internal world. If you're stressed about the deadline, tight feels more probable internally than fine. Hmm. And this tendency, this need to invent meaning based on ourselves is how we end up mishearing life itself, constantly tweaking reality to match our inner world.
That clicks. It means we're always experiencing the world through our own, personal filter, our level of consciousness, as the source puts it. And it's important to clarify, right? They don't mean consciousness in some mystical sense here. It's more about our dominant psychological or emotional frequency at any given time.
Absolutely. It's about the prevailing state of your mind. The main emotion, or maybe a strongly held belief that acts like a lens, dictating what gets priority and how incoming stuff gets interpreted. If your internal state is really strongly leaning one way, that creates this powerful pull on everything you perceive.
The source gives some really concrete examples of how different emotional states just completely change what people hear. Let's walk through those. They're quite illuminating.
Okay, yeah. Take someone who operates from a place of deep suspicion. They tend to assume negative intentions. So that internal bias means even when they hear something neutral, or maybe even intended kindly, their mind filters it through suspicion. They'll focus on a pause, a tone, an inflection, and interpret it as proof of deceit or manipulation, almost regardless of the actual words
It's
used.
like their brain is actively seeking confirmation for their paranoia. The sound just becomes evidence for what they already believe.
Precisely. Or consider someone who's generally fearful. Their whole system is primed for threat detection. So for them, a sudden noise, a door slamming, even just an abrupt change in conversation topic. It's not just background noise, it's instantly registered as a potential sign of danger. Their anxiety makes them listen for threats, and so guess what? They hear threats constantly.
And the flip side is just as powerful, isn't it? The person who comes from a place of, say, love or basic trust. The source suggests that this kind of person tends to perceive those positive qualities in others, even when things are difficult or critical.
Right. A person with a generally loving disposition, listening to maybe some harsh feedback, might still register the difficulty, but their primary filter allows them to perceive the underlying positive intent. Maybe they hear it as, this person cares enough to tell me this hard truth. They filter for the potential gentleness or care within the message. The listener's emotional baseline becomes the chief editor.
So it really brings us back to this core idea, the central thesis of our deep dive. When we consistently mishear or misinterpret people, the big revelation isn't necessarily about them. It's like looking in a mirror. If you're constantly hearing criticism or rejection or negativity, maybe you're actually getting a very accurate reading of the state of your own mind.
Which makes listening a potentially powerful diagnostic tool for self-awareness. If you find yourself constantly feeling attacked or misunderstood, the source suggests maybe the first step isn't to blame others, but to pause and consider if your own defensiveness or perhaps suspicion is the dominant filter distorting what's coming in. The work, then, isn't about fixing everyone else's communication. It's about recalibrating your own receiver.
That definitely shifts the focus, putting the responsibility for clarity much more on the listener's inner state. So if that's the case, what does correct listening actually look like? How do we move towards what the source calls true wakefulness?
Well, true wakefulness in this context isn't about achieving perfect auditory accuracy, like hearing every single syllable correctly. It's more of an internal quality. It's about achieving a certain internal clarity, a kind of purity. The source describes it as listening with a still mind.
A still mind.
Yeah.
Okay. That stillness implies letting go of that prejudice or bias we talked about earlier, right?
Mm.
If the mind isn't constantly jumping in to interpret, to judge, to project, it creates a kind of space.
Mm-hmm.
What happens then? What do you hear in that space?
When you genuinely let go of those preconceptions, you start to listen beyond just the surface words. You begin hearing the essence of the communication. The source puts it beautifully. You start to hear things that have never been said. You're tuning into the subtext, the context, the unspoken elements.
Ah, so that's where the really subtle stuff comes in. The things you only notice when your own internal chatter finally quiets down.
Exactly. Like, with a truly calm mind, you might hear the fatigue in someone's voice not just as tone, but you perceive the actual physical effort behind their words. You sense their tiredness. Or you might hear the silence of someone who's sad. You recognize the weight of their unspoken grief, the things they can't put into words because it's too much.
And bringing it back to ourselves, you also start to differentiate between the sounds of the world and the echo of your own internal voice, that constant commentary we mistake for reality.
Yeah.
You realize just how much of the perceived noise out there is actually your own thoughts and fears bouncing back at you.
And this ability to listen with quietude, that's framed as wisdom. The sources argue that a truly wise person isn't necessarily someone who hears a massive amount of information, but someone who knows how to listen with that calm, still mind. Because when the internal franticness drops away, the need to defend, interpret, project the world doesn't necessarily change, but your perception of it becomes much clearer.
This whole exploration really transforms listening, doesn't it? From just a passive act of receiving sound into, well, really active practice of self-reflection. We're constantly bombarded by external voices, people, media, just the sounds of life. But if this source material is onto something, perhaps the most valuable listening we can do is directed inwards, listening for the truth within ourselves.
And if we can stop that automatic impulse to fill every silence, every ambiguity with our own projections, especially our fears, then maybe the external world starts to seem less threatening, less complicated. The world just is. It's our interpretation that often makes it feel scary or hostile.
And that really feels like the promise here, doesn't it? Achieving that internal stillness. The idea is if you just stop for a moment today and listen sincerely, not trying to confirm your biases, but just to hear what is actually being communicated inside and out, you might find there's less to fear than you thought, and maybe just more to understand.
Yeah, so maybe an invitation for you, the listener. Try testing this out. In your very next conversation, maybe just pause for a second and ask yourself honestly, how many times might I have misheard someone simply because my own mind wasn't calm? Because I was agitated or defensive?
And maybe the really potent question to take away from this deep dive is this. If I make a conscious choice today to listen with a sense of gratitude or just calm intention, what part of my own inner world might get healed or at least revealed in that process?